The afternoon sun baked the school playground, turning the asphalt into a shimmering heat trap. Every surface radiated a dry, suffocating warmth that made the air ripple. Max stood at the edge of the yard, his eyes locked on the towering red slide. It stood like a silent monolith, its polished surface reflecting the harsh, unforgiving light. The structure loomed over the rest of the yard, a stark geometric intrusion against the cloudless sky. Max watched the way the light caught the metal curves, ignoring the chaotic noise of recess behind him. The other children were mere blurs of motion, distant and irrelevant. He felt the pull of the slide, a magnetic draw that made the rest of the world fade into a dull hum. He took a slow, deliberate breath, feeling the grit of the playground dust on his tongue. He shifted his weight, his focus narrowing until only the slide existed. He was no longer part of the group. He stepped away from the safety of the crowd, his gaze never wavering. The distance closed with every measured stride. He reached the perimeter. Miss Carter clapped her hands, her voice cutting through the recessed noise like a blade. "Class, listen up. The big slide is under repair. Do not go near it," she commanded. She pointed toward the orange safety tape. The plastic strip snapped against the metal frame with a sharp, rhythmic sound. Max watched the tape. To him, it was a flimsy, temporary obstacle. He stood perfectly still, his hands balled into tight fists at his sides. "I will be careful," he whispered, his voice buried under the surrounding shouts of his classmates. He did not look at Miss Carter. He watched the way the wind tugged at the orange barrier, testing its strength. He saw the loose knot where the tape met the frame. Max slipped away, stealthy steps. He kept his eyes fixed on the base of the ladder, his mind already committed to the ascent. He was ready to cross the line. He reached the base of the metal ladder. The rungs felt cool against his palms, a sharp contrast to the humid air pressing down on the yard. He paused, his head tilted slightly, listening for the sound of approaching footsteps. The playground noise was a chaotic jumble of distant shouts and laughter, but no one was looking his way. He was invisible. He grabbed the first bar and pulled himself up. The metal groaned under his weight, a low, metallic protest that seemed deafening. He did not flinch. He reached for the second rung, then the third. Each step was a quiet act of defiance. His sneakers scraped against the metal, creating a rhythmic clinking sound that echoed against the slide frame. He kept his eyes fixed on the bars directly in front of his face, refusing to look down at the ground he was leaving behind. The ladder felt solid, unyielding, and he moved with a deliberate, steady pace, his focus narrowing to the next grip. He reached the final rung and hauled himself onto the top platform. The transition was abrupt. One moment he was enclosed by the ladder, the next he was exposed to the open air. He stood up slowly, his legs feeling heavy and uncertain. Below him, the playground had transformed into a grid of colorful, miniature shapes. The swings were tiny pendulums. The sand pit was a mere patch of tan dust. The scale of the world had shifted, and with it, his sense of security vanished. A sudden gust of wind whipped across the platform, tugging at his balance. He swayed, his arms flailing instinctively to find purchase. But there was nothing to hold, except the thin, vibrating railing. The air up here was colder, thinner, and it carried a sense of hollow isolation. He looked down at the asphalt, now a dizzying distance away. The height was no longer a prize. It was a looming, physical pressure that pushed against his chest. He froze, his fingers digging into the metal edge. The ground seemed to tilt, and for the first time, the reality of his position settled in his gut like a stone. He was exposed, vulnerable. Max took a single, confident step toward the center of the platform. He wanted to see the entire yard from this vantage point. His weight shifted forward, but the metal beneath his foot did not hold. A sharp, piercing shriek of grinding steel erupted, vibrating through the soles of his feet. The platform edge buckled downward, snapping away from the frame with a violent jolt. Max felt the ground vanish beneath him. He lurched, his center of gravity swinging wildly into the empty space above the slide. He lunged for the railing, but his fingers caught only air, sliding uselessly over the slick, sun-baked surface. The entire structure groaned, tilting at a sickening angle that defied his attempt to regain his footing. He twisted his torso, trying to find purchase, but the slide frame was already dropping away. The world turned into a blur of spinning sky and distant asphalt. He reached out again, his hands clawing at the void. The metal shrieked one last time, a high-pitched protest as the platform disintegrated. He was no longer climbing, he was falling. The impact was absolute. Max struck the muddy earth with a sickening, heavy thud that knocked the air from his lungs. For a fraction of a second, there was only the jarring vibration of the ground against his frame. Then the pain arrived. It started as a sharp electric jolt in his lower leg, quickly escalating into a white-hot surge that radiated upward through his entire body. He tried to move, to roll away from the point of contact, but his leg would not obey. It lay twisted at an unnatural, jagged angle, pinned beneath him in the damp soil. He gasped, his chest heaving as he fought to pull in a steady breath, but each inhalation only amplified the throbbing ache. The world began to tilt. The playground, once a clear grid of shapes, blurred into a spinning vortex of colors and shadows. He pressed his palms into the grit, his fingers digging deep into the wet earth, but his strength failed him. His vision tunneled, the edges of his sight darkening. Every nerve ending seemed to scream in unison. He lay motionless, trapped by the sudden, overwhelming reality of his broken state. The sound of rapid, heavy footsteps cut through the ringing in Max's ears. He turned his head, his cheek pressing into the cold mud as Miss Carter skidded to a halt beside him. Her face was drained of color, her eyes fixed on the twisted angle of his leg. She did not hesitate. She dropped to her knees, the damp earth staining her skin, and immediately reached for the medical kit at her side. Her hands moved with a practiced, steady rhythm that contrasted sharply with the chaos of the moment. She cleared the mud away from the injury with quick, efficient swipes. Max flinched as her fingers brushed the skin, but she held firm, her gaze locked on his face to monitor his reaction. She pulled a long, stark white bandage from the kit. With a sharp tug, she began to wrap the material around his lower leg, pulling it tight to provide support. She worked in silence, her movements precise and calculated, securing the end of the bandage with a firm knot. She pressed her thumb against his foot, checking for a pulse. Max watched her hands, his breathing shallow and erratic. She looked up, her expression unyielding, and held his gaze until his frantic gasping began to slow. The transition to the bench was a blur of sharp, rhythmic pulses of pain. Max sat with his leg propped up, the limb feeling heavy and detached from the rest of his body. He stared down at his hands. They were caked in dry, gray mud, the grit embedded deep into the lines of his palms. He rubbed his fingers together, feeling the coarse texture of the soil he had clawed at only moments ago. The contrast was stark. His hands, once eager to scale the metal rungs, were now stained with the evidence of his fall. He shifted his gaze to the stark white bandage, wrapped tightly around his lower leg. It was a clean, rigid line against the backdrop of his skin, a physical boundary that forced his leg to remain still. The throbbing ache in his limb served as a constant, pulsing reminder of the distance between his intent and the reality of his choice. He looked toward the playground, then back at the bandage. From the wooden slats of the bench, the playground appeared as a distant, kinetic blur. Max watched his classmates dart between the monkey bars and the swing set, their laughter reaching him as faint, fragmented echoes. He shifted his weight, but the heavy, rigid cast on his leg anchored him firmly in place. It was a solid, undeniable weight that dictated his stillness. His eyes drifted across the yard, inevitably drawn to the red slide. It stood motionless in the heat, a towering structure that no longer beckoned him to climb. The orange safety tape remained, fluttering in the breeze like a warning flag. He stared at the vibrant color, tracing the way it snapped against the metal frame. What he had once perceived as a flimsy, ignorable obstacle now held a different meaning. It was a clear, unyielding line drawn between safety and the sharp, sudden pain. He looked down at his own leg, feeling the dull, throbbing pressure inside the cast. The contrast between his current immobility and the fluid movement. He did not feel the urge to move or to test the boundary again. Instead, he watched the tape dance in the wind, his heart heavy with the weight of the lesson. The slide remained a silent, looming monument to his choice, but the barrier no longer felt like a prison. It was a shield. He leaned back against the bench, the grit of the playground still lingering in his memory, and finally accepted the necessity of the distance.